Morning, everybody. So I'm back. I was down in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia for about a week and doing a lot of field work. So please check out my channel to see what I've been up to, especially the Capital One videos connected to MITRE and Northrop Grumman. They're really important, and I'm going to write that up in a short blog post. And before I left, I was we finished Tuck Everlasting, and I was trying to sort of think of what the next book I was going to read. And initially I was going to do Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner, but I just couldn't get myself excited about it. It just seemed too depressing. And, I think we're all struggling just a little bit right now. And so I just wanted to read another nice book. So this is sort of a short book, but I got it a few years ago when I was at Birch Bark Books in Minneapolis when we were doing a college visit way back when, and it's a lovely book called "It's Books and Islands in Ojibwe Country" by Louise Erdrich. And so I'm just gonna treat myself, and if you guys want to listen along, great. I know it's a little early, so there's not many people out there right now. But the other thing I want to mention, and maybe I'll link in the comment section, if you're not familiar with Louise Erdrich's work, she was from North Dakota, and I think of Chippewa mother and a German American father, and a lot of her books center sort of the indigenous experience and the conflict of sort of tribal people and the church and other things. And this book also talks a lot about Ojibwe and the worldview of the language of the Ojibwe people. So I think it's like a really lovely antidote. And so I am going to include a link to a short story by her that's available as a PDF called American Horse. And it's actually a much darker book, short story than this book is, but it talks about, it speaks to the social welfare services and family intervention and the breaking up of families by social welfare services. And I think as we move forward in the social impact finance space, those are really important reads. It's not a long read, it's pretty short, but I think it gives you a perspective in how NGO culture and government culture and civilizing culture sort of work into the equation. So, okay. So this was, again, it's Louise Erdrich, and it was originally published in 2003. Okay, so the first chapter is called Books and Islands. And there's a little map. So it's talking about the lake area above Minnesota between the US and Canada. Chapter 1, Books and Islands. My travels have become so focused on books and islands that the two have merged for me. Books, islands, islands, books. Lake of the Woods in Ontario and Minnesota has 14,000 islands. Some of them are painted islands, the rocks bearing signs, ranging from a few hundred to more than 1,000 years old. So these islands, which I'm longing to read, are books in themselves. And then there is a special island on Rainy Lake that is home to thousands of rare books, ranging from crumbling copies of Erasmus in the French and Heloise's letters to Abelard, dated, I don't know, it's some Roman numeral, long time ago, to first editions of Mark Twain, signed, to a magnificent collection of ethnographic works on the Ojibwe that might help explain the book islands of Lake in the Woods. I'm not traveling alone. First, my 18-month-old and still nursing daughter and I will pop over the Canada-US border and visit Lake of the Woods and the lands of her namesake, her grandmother. And then we'll dip below the border and travel east to Rainy Lake. And we'll put about 1,000 miles on our car and several hundred on other people's boats. I'm 48 years old and I can't travel aimlessly. I always seem to have a question that I would like to answer. Increasingly, too, it is this same question. It is the question that has defined my life, the question that has saved my life, and the question that has most recently resulted in the questionable enterprise of starting a bookstore. The question is, books. Why? The islands are really incidental. I'm not much in favor of them. I grew up on the Great Plains. I'm a dry land for hundreds of miles person, but I've gotten mixed up with people who live their lives on lakes. And then these islands have begun to haunt me, especially the one with all the books. Mazina Iganagan is the word for books in Ojibwe or Anishinaabemoan, and Mazing Peking Kintagan, I'm sorry for this, is the word for rock paintings in Ojibwe is the Algonquin language originally spoken by the Ojibwe people living throughout Michigan, Minnesota, Ontario, Manitoba, and on into North Dakota. And as you can see, both words begin with mazin. It is the root for dozens of words, all concerned with made images and with the substances upon which images are put, mainly paper or screens. As the Ojibwe people began to watch television and go to movies, the word came in handy. Mazinat nata sig wiga mig, movie theater, Mazinat sig jigan, television set, and they had a root word ready to make into a verb way back when Edward Curtis and the last Ernest Oberholzer came to photograph them. Mazinakizo, to be photographed. Nothing about stealing souls in the words mazinakizo. Photographers did not take Ojibwe souls. It wasn't that easy. Soul theft required the systematic hard work of inventive humiliations and abuse by the government and Catholic nuns and priests. The Ojibwe had been using the word Mazini Bagajigan for years to describe dental pictographs made on birch bark, perhaps the first books in North America. Yes, I figure books have been written around here ever since someone had the idea of biting or even writing on birch bark with a sharpened stick. Books are nothing all that new. People have probably been writing books in North America since at least 2000 BC, or painting islands. You could think of the lakes as libraries. 2000 BC is only the date of the oldest archaeological evidence found in the area we are going to visit. Traditional Anishinaabe people find the land bridge theory a concept convenient to non-Indians and insist they've been here forever. And in truth, since the writing or drawings that those ancient people left still make sense to people living in lake woods today, one must conclude that they weren't for the ancestors of the modern Ojibwe. They were and are the modern Ojibwe. Books. Why? Because our brains hurt. How a mother packs. For a week before I leave on my trip, I am distracted and full of cares. Just at the last minute, I always find myself doing things that I have put off for months, even years. I always change my will, and then I clean out the cabinets and file old letters. I make certain that we all have sufficient underwear, that money and phone numbers are in relevant hands, the dog's vaccinated for Lyme disease, the manuscript of the last book in production, the baby has her shots, and then I get more specific on the trip itself. I read books on pictographs and decide which notebooks to take along. Change the oil in the car, make sure my older daughters have postcards and shampoo. I buy tobacco, not to smoke, but to offer to the spirits of the lake and the spirits of the rock paintings we will visit. I gather gifts for the paintings, a ribbon shirt, some red cloth, sage bundles. I purchase 124 disposable diapers and one of those baby harnesses I see mothers using in the malls. If the baby goes over the edge of the boat or off an island, I picture myself hauling her right up. I go over plans for house sitting and financial reports and make certain that our bookstore doesn't need me. There are so many small things. It is the small things that will consume me. The sunblock, the elms that must be treated with fungicide, the shoes, the many sizes and types of shoes girls wear all through their lives. I tell myself that God, and meaning in the small things as well as in the vast. But where in the wilderness of shoes is God? In the laces, the rubber bumpers, the heels that swiftly rise at age 12? On the other hand, none of this matters at all. The attention to details is just a way to stave off facing the truth. I hate leaving home. Home. My 103-year-old house is surrounded by great trees. I have named each one of them. There is a guarding elm that leans and tosses to the west just beyond the blue gate. Tiny offshoot of the great Wahpeton maple grows alongside, only 6 feet tall. It is still shaped like a drumstick. I grew it from a seedling that took root in one of my mother's flower pots. Awkward and shy are the elms that flank these two trees. An old stalwart, the biggest tree in the neighborhood, stands guard around the corner in front of the house. Pensive, lover, and serene darling, haywire, and the entire trust are the locust trees that have sprung up in a ragged line along the edge of the yard. I have great admiration for these trees, as they seem unkillable, and their fronds of tossing leaves provide an ever-shifting and trembling pattern of shadows on the old cream-colored walls inside our house. Also, they leaf out last of all, and they lose their leaves last too every fall, providing one final bank of burnished glory before the blast off to winter. Our house was built as a wedding gift for a father's much adored daughter. His house, same layout, still stands next door. This house was built when the lake to our east was still a marsh, before it was dredged. Our house even looks a bit like a wedding cake, trimmed with spindle rails, bows carved over the window egg and dart molding, and a couple of round peephole windows. Perhaps one day we'll attach a cheesy 15-foot plastic bride and groom to the roof. During the 60s, our house was gutted and became a rooming house and then a duplex, and the interior lost its charming details and became just peculiar. Guests have seen a ghost on the top floor, and the girls hear it walking. They believe he is a confused man, and that's what we call him. Sometimes when one of my older daughters is gone for a while, the baby and I will sleep in her room so that the ghost of the confused man does not take up residence. I describe all of this because there can be no traveling unless there is a leave taking. And the traveling is all the more in earnest if the leaving is difficult. For me, leaving hurts. This is the dwelling of 4 essential beings, my daughters. And even when they are not here, all of their things are here. We don't mean to become attached to things, but we do. And rather than live in complete clutter, we're always culling, throwing, giving, and we have a lot of books in our house. They are our primary decorative motif. Books in piles on the coffee table, framed book covers, books sorted into stacks on every available surface, and of course, books on shelves on most walls. Besides the visible books, there are the boxes waiting in the wings, the basement books, the garage books, the storage locker books, and then they are sort of an insulation, soundproofing some walls. They function as furniture. They prop up sagging fixtures and, disguised by quilts, function as tables. The quantities and types of books are fluid, arriving like hysterical cousins in overnight shipping envelopes, only to languish near the overflowing mail bench. Advanced reading copies collect at bedside to be dutifully examined. To ignore them and read Henry James or Barbara Pym instead becomes a guilty pleasure. I can't imagine home without an overflow of books. The point of books is to have way too many, but to always feel you never have enough or the right one at the right moment. But then sometimes to find you'd long to fall asleep reading the aspirin papers. And there it is. Books. Another reason I can take home along anywhere in the person of a book, and I do. I pack W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz, and I bring Jim Crace's Quarantine and Being Dead, and then I add Saints and Strangers by Angela Carter and The Stone Diaries by Carol Shields, which everyone else has got to read, and that takes care of fiction. And as for nonfiction, I never go anywhere without a concise dictionary of Minnesota Ojibwe, John D. Nichols and Earl Nyholm. And I take along Joe Paddock's book on Ernest Oberholzer, Keeper of the Wild. And then I pack a bag containing all of my baby books, many of which I've laboriously blotted with whiteout, removing the English and replacing. Ojibwe is also slurred into the word Chippewa and is in its original form Anishinaabe, pronounced Anishinaabe. The word is very loaded and bears a host of meanings and interpretations and theories. I've heard that the Ojibwe refer to the puckering of the seams of traditional moccasins or makazinan, or that Ojibwe roasted their enemies until they puckered up. Gruesome. I've heard that Anishinaabe means from whence is lowered the male of the species, but I don't like that one very much. And then there's the more mystical, spontaneous beings. The meaning of that I like best, of course, is Ojibwe, from the verb as hibi ige, which means is to write. Ojibwe people were great writers from way back and synthesized the oral and written tradition by keeping mnemonic scrolls of inscribed bark. The first paper, the first books. The blue minivan. I am connected to and believe in my 1995 blue Windstar minivan. We have a history. I know exactly how to pack this vehicle and feel its personality is with me as I filled every crevice between, under, and behind the blue cloth seats. The blue Windstar is sisterly, accommodating, personable, and a gallant hauler. Used to be I'd pack 6 preteen girls, 2 dogs, large Aussies, and myself in, along with a week of food, clothes, games, and drawing material for a trip to a whole other island in Lake Superior, where I did research while the girls swam, screamed, ate roasted marshmallows, screamed, read Wonder Woman and Catwoman comics, slept, screamed, and woke screaming happily for a week or 2. I don't really know how I have accomplished anything ever. The minivan has been to North Dakota many times to visit Wahpeton, where my parents live, and to South Dakota, being my favorite sun dancer, my baby's father. And with the back seats removed, he could sleep comfortably on a futon. The Windstar came back a little bloodstained, loaded with slabs of pipestone, a great barrel-sized bundles of sage, a small prayer flag tied to its antenna. It made a traveling home for the sun dancer, the man whom we'll soon meet, who is named after low-lying clouds over the water of the lake we are going to visit. Okay. Nina Ikijikok. This is what I have been told. There are 4 spirit women who take care of all of the waters of the world. One woman cares for the oceans of salt water. A second woman cares for the freshwater, lakes, streams, and rivers. And yet a third woman cares for the waters inside of a woman that surround and cushion their babies. And the fourth woman looks after the rains, the clouds, the storms, the waters in the sky. And that woman cleans the sky up after a thunderstorm and makes sure the clouds are moving, the stars properly fixed in their places. She's always hard at work healing and arranging the sky so that the things flow in the right order and direction. The baby in the car seat directly behind me is named for that spirit woman, Nina Ikijikok. Her grandmother on her father's side had this name and was called Kijikok, Sky Woman, or Kizik, Sky for short. The original Nina Ikijikok was an imposing woman, tall and strikingly intelligent. The only image I have of her is from the back row of a boarding school class picture. She is blurred, of course, but obviously beautiful. Not pretty. Her features are too strong and cunning for merely pretty. This is Nina Izikok, is spoken of in Ojibwe as Nina Izijikokibaban. The Iban at the end puts her in the past, in the spirit world, where I imagine she is still dancing in her jingle dress. She was a well-known expert jingle dress dancer and even came to the Turtle Mountains to powwow. My mother, Rita Gorno Erdrich, grew up in the Turtle Mountains, and my family is still there, so I visit as often as I can. And I like to imagine Nina Ikijikokiban dancing with one of my mother's aunts, maybe Jane or Shayush. Baby Nina Izikakakok also has my mother's name, Rita, and so she's a grandmotherly little baby, I guess. She even has one gray hair growing on the back of her head. I am old to be a new mother, of course, and so is her dad. Our baby was born a great aunt, but we don't get into that. And as my brother Ralph says, a look of distress on his face, don't say any more about it. I knew she'd be coming like a great aunt already. I just don't want to know. Right now, Kizikok is playing with her baby cell phone. The plastic cell phone keeps saying, yellow triangle. It is a teaching cell phone, and she drops it and picks up her teaching hammer. It says, can we fix it? Yes, we can. She drops it and picks up a small musical box that lights and plays bits of Mozart and Bach. And she drops that and picks up a bright baby tape recorder that plays her late uncle, great uncle, Quek Wekibi, Wek, Quek Wekibines singing the Lake of the Woods song, which was given to the people in the dreams by the lake itself. And eventually she turns that off, eats a cracker, and as befits a child born with a gray hair, she is a very philosophical baby, personable and good natured. She fusses for perhaps 5 minutes, and she sleeps for 2 hours as we travel along a highway that was expanded from a road that was once a trail, an old Ojibwe trade route heading north. Songs traveled this route, and ceremonies, as well as pelts and guns, medicines, knowledge, sacred shells, and secular ideas traveled this road, but never at 65 miles an hour. The van is kind. The van is good. She's got new brake pads in alignment, and she will get us there. Asima, age, and gratitude. The word for tobacco is asema, and is essential to bring some for this reason. Spirits like tobacco. Their fondness for the stuff is a given of Ojibwe life. Tobacco offerings are made before every important request to spirits or to other humans. Tobacco is put down by the root if you pick a plant, in the water when you visit a lake, by the side of the road when starting a journey. Tobacco is handed to anyone with whom you wish to speak in a serious manner. It is given for a story or as an invitation to join someone in teaching or a writing project. Tobacco begins every noteworthy enterprise and is given as a thank you at the end of every significant event. Perhaps spirits like tobacco because they like the fragrance of its smoke, or because people like tobacco and they appreciate thoughtfulness. My grandfather made the old-time kinnikinnick red willow tobacco, a smoking mixture of shaved willow bark, sage, and other local herbs. Ojibwe people still use and make red willow tobacco, but the tobacco offered these days is most often bought in pipe shops or purchased in small foil packets. Sometimes I'm offered cigarettes to help with the project or listen to someone's problem. I quit smoking years ago. I began to cut down once I started running, for I soon realized that rolling a Bull Durham ciggy after a painful 3-mile jog and puffing away to recover was counterproductive. So, as I am now pure, I dismantle the cigarette, place the tobacco on the ground, and then either bury or throw away the filter. My favorite tobacco comes from a pipe shop in Minneapolis and is called Nokomis, the Ojibwe word for grandmother. It is a rich, black, softly shredded, moist stuff with a darkly sweet scent. Before I take a trip like the one I'm taking now, I always buy a pound or two of this tobacco and divide it into smaller bags. Some are for the baby to give to other people, and some are for the spirits of the places we are going to visit. There was a time when I wondered, do I really believe all of this? I mean, I'm half German, rational. Does this make any sense? And after a while, such questions stopped mattering. Believing or not believing, it was all the same. I found myself compelled to behave toward the world as if it contained sentient spiritual beings. The question of whether or not they actually existed became irrelevant. After I'd stopped thinking about it for a while, the ritual of offering tobacco became comforting and then necessary. Whenever I offered tobacco, I was, for that moment, fully there, fully thinking, willing to address the mystery. Therefore, I've taught my children to offer tobacco at the same time that I rail at them not to smoke it. The baby is adept at dipping her hand into the bag and waiting for the right moment to scatter the flakes. If allowed to, she'd keep offering tobacco until the bag is used up. She does it with such sweet solemnity, it is hard to stop her. Nadanis, my daughter, I am still amazed to find her here. Actually, I put down a lot of tobacco when I found out that I was going to have a baby. I needed every bit of spiritual help I could get. Maybe I'll get used to the fact that she is here by the time I'm 64 years old and clapping wildly at her high school graduation. And when I walked into the midwife's office with a positive pregnancy test, one of my first questions was, what kind of statistics are there on women who have babies at 47? Gently, I was told that statistics were unavailable because there just aren't that many women having babies at 47. And still, I was dazzled. I felt like Mary at the Annunciation. Mary with PMS. I wept. I snarled. I laughed like a hyena. I knew I was frightening to others, filled with a bewildering array of hormones. I'd gone from perimenopausal to violently pregnant. And on the wall behind my midwife, there was a framed poster of that obnoxious poem about the woman who looks forward to getting old so that she can wear purple. I happened to be wearing purple that day, and I was old, and I was pregnant. What did this mean? Along with the dazzled feeling, I was struck by the awful burden of it all. How would I do it? I don't suppose the Virgin Mary felt sorry for herself, but I did. And then suddenly I thought of a most wonderful consolation. Books. Why? To read and read while nursing a baby. And there's a little picture there. Okay, I'll do a second chapter. We'll do an hour. So chapter 2 is islands. The problem of meeting up in Ojibwe country. By the end of the first day, we are in Bemidji, Minnesota, home of the giant replicas of Babe the Blue Ox, Paul Bunyan, and most importantly, where my brothers live now. Louise Erdrich, named from my German grandfather, is an environmental engineer who oversees all the systems managers throughout the northern tier of Ojibwe country down here in the United States. He is in charge of making sure that reservations all through Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota have adequate water and sewage and waste disposal systems. And this is a vast job. But Louis deals with it unflappably with toxic waste and buried gas tanks. My other brother, Ralph Erdrich Jr., is the head emergency room nurse at Red Lake Hospital on Red Lake Reservation just north of Bemidji. He sews up local brawlers, delivers babies, and extracts quantities of fish hooks from various parts of Red Lake Ojibwe bodies. We have some difficulty deciding where to meet for dinner, at Perkins or Country Kitchen. As we all worked at a country kitchen in Wahpeton, North Dakota, me as a waitress and a hostess and my brother as cooks, there is a nostalgia factor. But as, therefore, we also know exactly what went on behind the scenes at Country Kitchen, we opt for Perkins. The interior is crowded, steamy, loud with families. Between the two of them, my brothers have 5 sons and 1 tiny new daughter. And we are sitting around 3 pushed-together tables, ordering baskets of onion rings and hash browns and chili and sandwiches, when suddenly I am overcome by a great feeling of happiness. My brothers are loyal and kind fellows, and they have seen me through tough times. When my husband died in 1997, they took off work to come and stay with me, to answer the telephone and guard my children. They also made sure I didn't stay in bed all day or chew the woodwork. They helped the household keep functioning. They kept my world partly normal. They are tall and sturdy, and they make me feel safe. And now, as we sit in Perkins, eating deep-fried foods and dressing-drenched salads, I am again comforted by their solid presence. We don't have to be analytical, and we don't have to be literary. We don't have to talk about anything at all, really. It is enough to be together, to enjoy the continuity and the weird Erdrich history. They are tireless professionals in their work, but sweet and non-judgmental in their personal lives. They are what women in the Midwest call guy guys. They do guy things like fish and watch football and refinish furniture and tinker with dangerous electrical wiring. In their guyness, they relate easily to my guy, Tobasenkut, the sun dancer and the father of Kizikok. They ask about him and about my plans for this trip. And I am forced to say that, as usual, I have no exact idea how I will actually meet up with him, although as always, I'm sure it will happen. Meeting up is always complicated in Ojibwe country, and it never seems to happen as it was planned. Tobasenkut, who is a traditional healer, as well as a tribal politician, teacher, and negotiator, is always being called on life or death missions. He has devoted his life to helping people. He is a one-man spiritual ER. And so when making plans, I have found it best to be prepared to wait. I have found it best to understand things will always change and take a long time. Important and essential items will be lost, mislaid, then found, and then they will need to be repaired. And I have found it best to travel with everything I need in order to spend a comfortable night anywhere, even in my car. I spend one, though, at Bemidji's Holiday Inn Express, and the next morning, as soon as Kizikok and I have investigated the continental breakfast and partaken of 4 kinds of dried cereal, including Fruit Loops, we drive straight north past Red Lake Reservation on US 72, heading for Baudette, where I will cross the border. I'm revved up on a cup of unfamiliar coffee, Holiday Inn Express coffee. Kizikok drifts off after operating a plastic blender that chimes Old MacDonald in the barks of dogs, the croaks of frogs, or the mews of cats, or all at once. And this is a strangely complicated toy made in China. And I am very happy as I now get to glimpse some of my favorite country, the Mashkig, or bog, between Red Lake and Lake of the Woods. It is traditionally the great Ojibwe pharmacy. It is full of medicines. There is Labrador tea, or swamp tea, makigobug, snake root, which I should be carrying for good luck and health on this journey. There's balsam, a laxative, iniwi-wunj, or milkweed, used as on whistles and as a charm for drawing deer. Pitcher plant, or omukiki widasum, which makes great toys. The Ojibwe name means frog leggings, and there is willow for indigestion, for basket making, the inner bark for kinnick and headaches, makibug, sumac for dysentery, white cedar for coughs, high bush cranberry, blueberries, juneberries, wild currants, gooseberries, Winabojubikuk for snakebite. That's Winnabuju's arrow, Winnabuju nokomis, Winnizun, painted cup, or Winnabojo's grandmother's hair, used for rheumatism and for the diseases of women. One medicine I do use is ginnabig, or snake medicine. I've got some in a plastic baggie. Puffball powder is the spores of dried puffballs collected from those white, round, low-growing mushrooms that grow everywhere, even on city boulevards. Put this powder on a cut or scrape and it heals immediately. All of these medicines and countless others grow on either side of the highway, in the tamarack bog, an ecosystem so vibrantly rich that traditional Ojibwe teachers and healers still go to fast there to show their respect for the medicines and learn from these plants. Red willow, stands of maple, watery alder, and birch give at last to neat little towns and isolated farms. Up near the border, Baudette, we buy supplies and also phone cards. The phone cards are often useless in Canada, but I buy them anyway. And then we are across the border and heading up to Morrison, Ontario, through big grassy First Nation reserve on a familiar little highway dotted with construction crews, repairing the constant erosion and washouts. I park the blue minivan at a dock in Morrison. The owner of the New Moon Fishing Lodge, Rocky Moen, helps me unload the van and transfers the duffels, the camera equipment, the portable crib into the lodge boat. Rocky is a kindly and intelligent man and seems devoted to the ecology of the lake. We started talking immediately about the rock paintings as we proceed directly to the island that his family has owned since the 1950s. Rocky is intrigued with the paintings near his lodge, and he is still angry about the defacement of those paintings decades ago. Stupid, 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 he says. It bothers me a lot, and I know the person who did it. And when I ask the person's name, though, Rocky just looks pained. The trip to the island takes about 45 minutes, and the mainland is blazing hot this July. The cool breeze is a relief. Kizikok stands in the whipping wind, and I hold tightly onto the handle of the back of her life jacket and grasp one leg too, just to make sure. Boats make me very uncomfortable. At any moment, I think we'll ram into a rock and the boat will sink. But I'll still be gripping the baby. I'll tow her to shore. There are plenty of islands around here, and I never go out onto the lake without carrying my pocket Ziploc baggie of waterproof matches. And once I tow the baby to shore, I'll light a fire, fan the smoke, and eventually someone will come to investigate, and we will be saved. During this short ride, it becomes so lost in my fantasy of boat wreck that it is only with a wrench that I return to the immediate fact that we are traveling along so far so good and we are not capsizing. Rocky seems completely at home on the lake. We'll probably be safe. I don't relax my grip on Kizikok, but I do force myself to abandon my fantasy and look around at the stunning beauty. The islands jut from the lake, tall, with 100-year pines, rocky and severe. The water glimmers with power, and great tangles of second-growth brush ride by, cut with sloughs and passageways. High cliff faces shadowed with caves loom over us, and there are dense island groupings, great lazy white rocks sprawled like animals just above the water. Clusters of birds, pelicans, appear to stand right on the water, but we were actually balancing on the tips of dangerous underwater reefs. Once I'm lost in the actual beauty of the lake, I relax a little, and it isn't long before we are drawing up to the lodge dock where a young Ojibwe man named Ryle, for Louis Ryle, the great French Ojibwe Métis leader who came near to establishing a Métis nation, helps us disembark. Kisakok and I settle ourselves into a cabin with a window that catches the breezes off the lake, and we will hear loons laughing madly at night, all night, sometimes close, sometimes echoing from the shore to shore. Outside, the great rock we're staying on slopes dramatically into deep water. My baby actually could fall off this island. Still living here will make it easy to set up our trips to see the rock paintings. In the past, we've camped out on the islands, deciding from day to day where to pitch a tent, but I don't want to camp with baby along. She's quick, she's curious, she's smart, and she likes to put rocks in her mouth. Maybe when she's older, we can deal with open fires, slippery reefs, bugs, poison ivy, and wood ticks. Well, the wood ticks we'll deal with anyway. Here's one. Here's another. They're inevitable up here. Right now, Kisakok appreciates a bit of grass to run across and a predictable routine. A period of emptiness unusual to my life now begins, in which I can either fret or accomplish that rare thing, the doing of nothing. Or rather, with the baby, the doing of what the baby wants. This kind of doing is very much part of the trip, and although there is a dreamy blankness to it, the hours merge and the edges of the days grow fuzzy. These times when I devote my whole self to Kisakok are also times of great complexity and learning. I learned, for instance, that she can keep a little stone in her mouth for an entire day. The second morning on the island, I see her bend over, pick up a little white oval stone, and touch her mouth with it. But when I pry her mouth open, I can't find it. Perhaps I've just imagined that it went in. She gives me a betrayed look, clenching her jaws, and so I quit searching for the rock. We eat our breakfast, and then we put on swimming suits, and we sit for hours on one side of the island watching crayfish, Ashageshinib as they emerge in the spidery shadows from the cracks of a half-submerged rock. They are fearless and dart for our toes, waving pinchers. We remove them with sticks so that we can ease off the rock and bob around in the lake together in our bright red life jackets. We surprise an otter who has come to feast on the Ashageshinhyag. He circles a cabin with a sinuous lope, and then in confusion starts towards us, and he pauses on the clipped grass of the island lawn, a huge, glossy boy. His whiskers quiver comically as he takes our measure, and with a fabulous flop, he is down the rock in the water, paddling off on his back, and he watches us for a long time before he ducks under and is gone. I'm very happy now. I wanted to see an otter on this trip because they are among my favorite animals, and we know this is their feasting ground just 10 miles north. This place is in Siamo Bay. There, Kisakok's grandmother and namesake, the original Nina Izikok, played as a child. The otter's picnic ground is a large rock where we always find empty turtle shells, and it is rather sad, but I can't help thinking how conveniently packaged a turtle is to an otter, like a kind of Big Mac in a crush-proof box. And when visiting Otter's lunch spot, scattered with perfectly empty shells, it is impossible not to imagine the otters lolling around, sucking the turtles out and maybe making a munching side of lichen or a crayfish. Late that night, I am getting little Kisakok ready for bed, and I see an unfamiliar flash of white and fish the stone from her mouth. And I hold it in my hand, and I look at her in distress. My sister and brother-in-law are pediatricians. This stone is a classic choking hazard. Do you understand that, Kisakok? Choking hazard? I look into her warm, round face and try to explain, and she puts her hand on my arm in a motherly way and shakes her head indulgently. I recognize the look. My teenage daughters give it to me. Oh, Mom, I'm fine, and you just worry too much. My head whirls. Yes, everybody else was drunk and high on crack and heroin and many other drugs you haven't heard of and don't want to. And worst of all, they were keeping stones in their mouths. Choking hazards while having unprotected sex. And so I sat outside the party on the porch with the fireflies and thought about how I don't need to do these things to have a good time. I'm getting anxious about my daughters. The fact that they are utterly responsible and I know they are safe doesn't matter. I've got to worry. I'm also getting anxious about Tobasenkut. All of this time, Tobasenkut is trying very hard to get to us. I always know that. I imagine that he must find a way to tow his boat to the lake and then to dry out some spark plugs in the motor probably. As well, he will encounter various other delays, all based on quirks of the boat and requests from other people. Besides, it is summer, and that is the busiest time for Ojibwe people. For the past 2 months, Tobasenkut has been helping people meet their spirits. He does this by putting them out to fast for visions. He puts people in his sweat lodge and then into his boat and drives them to an island and leaves them there for 4 days and worries and prays for and checks on them during those 4 days and then picks them up and feeds them ceremonially and assists them in understanding their experience. He has put out hundreds of people and picked them up hundreds of times and listened to their dreams and helped them understand their insights and their suffering. And when he picks them up, as they have not eaten or drunk water during these 4 days, and they have heard or seen things unexpected, and they have been alone in the night and often frightened, they can barely speak. And they have a certain look in their eyes, and he is very careful with them. He has been very careful with the 3 friends who arrived the next day, and I'm very glad. And now I have people to wait for him along with me. These people have fasted at the pictographs that we will visit, and every time they come to Lake of the Woods, they come prepared to become extremely hungry. This time, they have decided to experience the lake in a new way, full. On the way here, however, they couldn't help stocking up on food and drink. They have developed a Pavlovian response to the lake, and they find it hard to believe that they will be fed. But they are fed, and copiously. The food at the fishing lodge, provided by a dedicated cook named Donna, is right out of small town North Dakota. It is haute cuisine if you lived in Wahpeton during the mid-1970s. A relish plate, prime rib, thick cuts of ham, tiny bowls of cauliflower drenched in cheese sauce, always some form of potato, mashed, fried, scalloped, and pitchers of iced tea. Homemade bread, baked chicken, pie, salads of iceberg lettuce and pale tomato. Kijikok sits high in her booster seat and eats with a fork. She is talented at this. We think it betokens an unusual and preternaturally advanced hand-eye coordination. Perhaps she will be a famous basketball player. I won't allow her to become a fighter pilot. Her red napkin is tucked around her neck. All around us, great stuffed fish leap and gape on the walls, and I feel increasingly like one of them. The lake, or Tobasenkut, the lake. Tobasenkut arrives. During the last 15 minutes of the northern dusk light, he pulls up to the dock, and there he is, looming toward us with a fixed weariness. I have just decided that he and the lake are one person, and that is a relief. For if to describe one is also to describe the other, I am set free. Both are so vast and contradictory and full of secrets that I both despaired of and was delighted with the prospect of never getting an adequate handle on them. But now that he has actually arrived, I feel that I should introduce Tobasenkut. And so to do so, I must go back to 1688, when a 20-year-old French explorer named Jacques de Noyan wrote about a group of people who nearly killed him when he raided their gardens of squash, corn, pumpkin, beans, and potatoes on what is now Garden Island in Lake of the Woods. According to Tobasenkut, as de Noyan and his men approached the gardens, an arrow was fired from the woods and landed at their feet. As any rational people would, they stopped, and then from those trees there emerged a giant people, taller than any native people they'd ever met, and very frightening. He got to know them a little and called them the people of the cat. Those people were Tobasenkut's ancestors, who became the Big George family and are of the Bijou or Lynx Dodem. Tobasenkut's people still tend to be tall, raw-boned, rangy, handsome, I think, and with a wariness that can shift from kind to belligerent. They are not a people to be trifled with, but for all that, Tobasenkut is exceedingly gentle, and babies seem to know this. Around my extended family, he's always the one who sits and talks to the babies, and yet he's tough in a way people who have been through too much are tough. But he can sleep anywhere, or go for days without really sleeping when his presence is required in ceremonies. Yet, although he went hungry as a child, he won't eat just anything. He's finicky about his food. He doesn't eat much meat. He passes on fry bread. I'm just seeing how many. Okay, I'm good. He passes on fry bread, orders salads in restaurants, unusual eating habits for Ojibwe. And as I said, he's full of contradictions like this lake. Tobasenkut grew up on a spit of land called Niyawan-Gashing in a time before the Ojibwe or the Anishinaabe were removed from their homes in the islands. He is fortunate to know something of the time when his community was intact, when the bays were dotted with cabins and camps, and when his extended family lived more or less by the spiritual seasons of the Mediwiwin, the grand medicine teachings. And those ceremonial teachings formed the moral and social character of the community. The teachings made sense of the beauties and the hardships of Ojibwe existence. It was also unfortunate, for the world was thrown asunder in just a few years. After his people had stabilized their lives and partly recovered from the wave of 19th century invasions and diseases, the Canadian government invented devastating Aboriginal policies. It is his burden to have seen what survived of the Ojibwe world around him nearly demolished by death, removal, forced relocation, the poison of alcohol, and to have experienced an education that amounted to kidnapping and a brutal attempt at brainwashing. The place where Tobasenkut grew up, Niyawan-Gashing, is about 3 or 4 miles by water from the fishing lodge. It is very useful for us to have a base of operations so close to the places that we want to visit, but it is not uncomplicated. Camp owners have become almost the only residents in land that once belonged and by treaty rights should still belong solely to the Ojibwe. The only native peoples staying at the lodge now are the fishing guides, Real and 2 other men. Tobasenkut once worked as a fishing guide, but he knows and is part of the lake in a much more profound way than where to catch walleyes for wealthy non-Indian sport fishers. He knows the lake in a way that only Indigenous people can truly know anywhere. At one time, everyone who lived near the lake was essentially made of the lake. As the people lived off fish, animals, the lake's water, and the water plants for medicine, they were literally cell by cell composed of the lake and the lake's islands. Tobasenkut's father once said to him, "The creator is the lake, and we are the waves on the lake." Tobasenkut shows us the place in the heavens from which the creator descended. Their origins are familiar. The cosmology is in the surrounding landscape, in the stars, in the shapes of the rocks and the islands, in the Mazina Pikinagagan, the paintings that his people made on the sides of the rocks. The next day, we get into the 16-foot alumina craft with a 115 horsepower motor, and we buzz out onto the lake. Before anything else, we go to visit Niyawan-Gashing, and there are still 2 fish camp houses standing and 1 tumbled-in cabin of weathered wood. 2 docks twisted and upended by ice. A strong little black bear stands next to the first dock, watching us calmly, and we cut the motor. The bear slides into the channel and dog paddles with powerful assurance to the other side, where he doesn't hide himself at all, but stands up and rakes the berry bushes underneath a tree containing a huge eagle's nest. One eagle hulks stubbornly next to the nest, watching over an eaglet whose head pops up curious from time to time, and we skirt a long pale boulder with a crease down the middle just opposite the former camp, romantically secluded. Hundreds of Anishinaabe were conceived on that rock, says Tobasenkut. I look at the gray hollow in the rock. It actually looks pretty comfortable. Nobody lives at Niyawan-Gashing anymore, except the bears and the eagles, and so we stop only long enough to put down tobacco. And sometimes the bears, especially the curious young, sit in the trees and watch the people on the shore. Sometimes a little bear will get caught in the crotch of a tree and hang himself. And when such a skeleton is found, it is very sacred to the Ojibwe and is used in religious ceremonies. Once, when Tobasenkut was little, there was a big Midewiwin, or Grand Medicine Lodge, in the grass that is now quickly returning to scrub trees and sumac. A Midewiwin lodge is made of young, bent-over popple or birch poles tied together with basswood. Spruce boughs or ferns are tied along the sides for shade, and the main events of the religion are carried out in the lodge. And when Tobasenkut was about 6 years old, a strange event took place at the Midi Lodge here at Niawanagashing. Tobasenkut's memory. He watched 6 canoes approaching from the west, one bearing a man and a dog, and they pulled to shore, and the explanation for their coming was given. The man with the dog had suffered an oppressive dream. It was a dream that he could not mentally evade even once he awoke, and in the dream he had learned that he once had been a slave owned by the Buanag, who were for generations bitter enemies of the Ojibwe. And as a slave, this man dreamed that he had been tied up with the dogs, and like the dogs, fed scraps, not fed at all, despised and kicked and beaten. And one afternoon, he just was about to die of sorrow and loneliness when it occurred to him to speak to the dog next to him, who answered. And the dog told him that the dog people had been waiting for the man to talk to them. And now he had spoken, and they were willing to help him escape the Buanag. There will be some feathers, said the dog, and you will chase them. And when the Buanag look at you, they will not see a man. They will see a dog playing with some feathers, and you will run after the feathers until you are far from the Buanag camp. And in this way, the man was freed from his degradation. And the man who dreamed that he was the man enslaved by the Sioux understood when he woke that he and his dog must give thanks to those dream dogs by fasting together. And so the canoes had come, accompanying him to the Midewiwin Lodge, where he would fast for 12 days, his dog for 4 days. And during those 12 days, the children were to treat the man just as the Buanag had, mean, though they were to respect the dog. Tobasenkut could not be cruel to the man who cried and groaned in his hunger as he lay in the lodge. The dog fasted alongside his master and then was feasted like a human being. The man continued until he weakened so badly that he could not move. But he survived, and in the end, he was feasted too. There was nothing where that lodge was but poison ivy and grass and a broken table. Tobasenkut's dream is to rebuild the lodge there and teach people all that he knows, including what the rock paintings mean. To this end, he has started a foundation to gather money to put up this lodge. He has also filed a claim for compensation against the Oblate Order of the Catholic Church. They were in charge of his education, but instead they stole life, innocence, and spirit from him and from his people. He thinks that they should be responsible for helping reconstruct what was lost. Perhaps someday a Midi Lodge will stand where the table had collapsed. Perhaps the old Midewiwin songs will be heard on Niawanagashing once again. Nagamonan. Songs belong to these islands. When the Ojibwe people fast in these islands, the songs, even if lost for a time, will always come back in dreams. The Nagamonan, these very old songs are as old as the rock paintings. Songs were composed often by those who owned drums for honor, for celebration, for beauty, for love. There's one particular song that haunts Tobasenkut and has as well a special meaning for me. Our friends often sing this song in their sweat lodge. It is a song used to help those struggling with the pitiless, uncanny, and baffling disease that is alcoholism. The words of the song, this is going to be hard. Ki wash webishki inigo anish dash inigo are the words of a long ago drunk who had found his way to sobriety, not through a 12-step program, but through the intervention of a powerful spirit. All of this happened during the 18th century when the fur trade began the first wave of alterations that would forever shift the economic, social, and spiritual balance of Ojibwe life in Lake in the Woods. Tobasenkut always begins his story of this song by attributing it to his uncle, Kwek Wekibiness. Very traditional people are always very careful about attribution. When a story begins, there is a prefacing history of that story's origin that is as complicated as the modern language association guidelines to form in footnotes. And in this story, there was a young man, an extraordinary hunter who was known as an unusually strong and generous nature, and he began to sell his furs to the first trader in the islands. And at first, the young hunter acquired blankets, fire strikers, kettles, guns, and ammunition. He traded for things he needed, his family needed, his wife, his children. But eventually, he traded for liquor too. A form of trader's rum mixed with hot pepper and tobacco became his pleasure. He bought a little more each time he came with piles of beaver skins. The trader began to provide him with the liquor before they finished their negotiations, and soon the young man woke from his long binges and found that he owed the trader, and that he had drunk up his pay and then some. And then he began trading for rum alone, and his children left him, his wife left him, his whole family stayed away from him, and the animals stayed away from him too. It was no use hunting, and so he traded his gun for a keg, and it was no use trapping, and so he drank away his traps. And finally, it was no use begging either, no use in anything. And the trader's liquor had eaten his life, his loves, his strength, his mind, his will, and all but a fraction of his spirit. And this tiny part of his spirit, this fraction of the man that was still a man, decided that it would disappear into the wilderness. And so the young man walked away from the trading house and from all the trade goods, including the rum, and he walked off into the snow without a blanket and without a gun, and he walked until he was blinded by the snow glare, exhausted to the last degree. And in the deepest moment of despair he had ever known, he threw himself down in a trackless place at the mercy of the spirits. And when he was face down in the snow, as he had determined that he would surely die, he heard a song. The Nagamon began like this. Kiwash kui, bishi kui, inigo, anisha, dash, indigo. I am a drunk, I am nothing. And the song went on, and he sang the whole of it into the place beyond the bottom of a drinking cup that is the darkest place on earth. And as he sang this song over and over, and as he wanted to die, this young man heard a voice. It was the voice of the Quinawage. The Quinawage is a spirit of dark strength and cleverness represented by an animal, the wolverine. Among the Ojibwe, this animal has almost supernatural reputation. There is one who steals from your traps and cannot be caught. There is one who you know is watching you, but you cannot see him or hear him. There is an animal who follows you just out of sight. It is deathless, lonely, and somewhat strange in his contempt for human intelligence. He easily outwits the smartest hunters, and when the Creator passed near the earth in the form of a tailed light that was the Quinawage, and when a man feels eyes in his back and experiences a thrill of unreasonable fear out in the woods, that is the Quinawage. And perhaps it is because he is so fearless, so impervious to pain, so dangerously strong. The spirit of the Quinawage is the only one that can address the problems of the Shekwebi, the alcoholic. For the disease is without pity, just as is the animal. Alcohol is cunning and is phenomenally deceptive. And so when the animal spoke to the young man and said he had been watching him and that he had given this young man a song, it might have been the first time the Quinawage was known to pity anyone. And if it was the first time that the spirit had showed pity in all the years of the Ojibwe hardship, then it goes to show how terrible this scourge of alcohol was and how low it laid the people. And the voice of the Quinawage saved the young man, though, and he got rid of the trader's poison, and he recovered his life. There are no Anishinaabe, including mixed bloods like me, whose lives have not been affected by the perplexing pains of addiction. The degraded longing and despair of alcoholism changes even the most intelligent among us. And so when we regard the place where the song was given by the Quinawage was first heard by the young man so long ago, it is for me a personal moment. And I hold our baby tighter, and we put out handfuls of tobacco. The 4 stones. Tobasenkut's copy of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous is covered with a handmade leather case. It is marked and thumbed and interleaved with personal notes and ribbons. It is like a preacher's Bible or a writer's favorite dictionary. He has carried the 12 steps with him for over 35 years, but his uncle, Kwek Wekibines, who knew nothing of the steps, surprised him once by telling him something about the book he had not perceived. Kwek Wekibines was devoted to the sweat lodge ceremony, in which stones are superheated and then cooled with water to produce a healing steam. In every Ojibwe ceremony, the number 4 is sacred. 4 seasons, 4 directions, 4 phases of life, 4 of everything. Kwek Webines held Tobasenkut's book and told him that it contained 4 stones. Intrigued, Tobasenkut examined the book for the stones, and after reading it painstakingly, found 3. He couldn't find the last one until one day he noticed, in the beginning of the book, a gravestone. John Tanner and the Landscape of Hunger. This is John Tanner country, where he was always hungry. One of my favorite books, The Falcon, a narrative of captivity and adventures of John Tanner during the 30 years of residence among the Indians of the interior of North America, is about the relentless efforts of a man to feed himself. My sisters and I read this book in its old Ross and Haynes edition until the spine gave, the pages tumbled out, and were held together by a rubber band. John Tanner's narrative exerted a fascination on us, and not only because one of our ancestors was mentioned in its pages, but because of the enigma of John Tanner himself. My sister Lisa says that it is the only true sequel to that great American novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which ends when Huck and Jim light out for the territory. And on the first page of his narrative, John Tanner wishes as a boy that he could go and live with the Indians. And during the next few pages, he is indeed captured by the Shawnee. It is 1789, and the rest of the novel is about what exactly happens in the territory. John Tanner was brought north, sold, adopted, and from then on lived entirely as an Ojibwe. And for the most part, he hunted throughout the Lake of the Woods country and into Rainy Lake, the exact range of the area I'm visiting on this trip. I've read his narrative so often that it is a constant mental reference. I see the region as it is and was, and when I think about John Tanner's life in the flimsy billboards, border crossings, cheap plastic gas station signs, and hopeful fishing lodge ads, look pathetically superimposed on a region harsh, mystical, and quite beyond the practical efforts of human beings to tame it. Out here on the lake, those human efforts are sparse and seasonal. It doesn't take much imagination to see myself in Tanner's world. John Tanner led a feast or famine life. His tale was told after he had attempted to return to civilization and found its restrictions irksome. Tanner, whose Indian name was Wa Benase, or Falcon, was captured at 9 years old, specifically to comfort a woman who had lost her own son. But his stepfather and brother nearly killed him, and he was fortunate enough to be sold to an extraordinary and resourceful Ojibwe woman, Netnokwa, whom he came to love. His portrait of Netnokwa is a treasure. Tanner had a gift for description and an ear for anecdote, and in his voice, Netnokwa is a stereotype busting powermonger. And when she approached the fort at Mackinac with her flag flying from her boat, well, it was probably a flag that described her personal dream vision, she was saluted by the fort's gun. She was a shrewd trader, an observant hunter, and a medicine woman who also got smashed on whiskey from time to time. She saved her family many times with her resourcefulness in times of crisis, and she and Tanner developed a particular affection for one another. Though Netnokwa was now decrepit and infirm, he says near the end of her life, I felt the strongest regard for her and continued to do so while she lived. Tanner had a clear eye, and in his narrative, he provides detailed descriptions of the world around him. A terrified female bear picks up her cub and cradles it like a human. He recounts his surprise at a porcupine's trusting stupidity and notes that it was quite tasty. An otter exhausts him with its tenacious fury when he tries to kill it with his bare hands. Tanner attended to animal behavior with a terrible fixity of purpose, for game was the only real food, and his relationship with nature was one of practical survival. At the leanest times, Tanner's family was forced to boil and eat their own moccasins, to subsist on the inner bark of trees or dead vines. During the best of times, the food was eaten all at once, and drink, if there was any, consumed until it disappeared. Indeed, the kind of life where a few people killed a fat moose and polished it entirely off in a few days, is mirrored in the binge or abstinence lifestyle of drinking that Tanner describes. Not a life for the moderate, not a life for the faint of heart. Tanner's ordinary feats of hunting endurance are almost beyond comprehension in these days of radio-collared bear dogs and high-powered telescopic rifles. And yet, he was by his own account no more than a mediocre hunter who was patiently instructed by Ojibwe who had survived for millennia without guns or steel. This looks like a quote. I had occasion to go to the trading house on Red River, and I started in company with a half-breed who is mounted on a fleet horse, and the distance we had to travel has since been called by the English settlers 70 miles. We rode and went on foot by turns, and the one who was on foot kept hold of the horse's tail and ran, and we passed over the whole distance in one day. And when I returned to my family, I had but 7 bullets left, and there was no trader near, and I could not at present get more. And with those 7, I killed 20 moose and elk. Oftentimes in shooting a moose or elk, the ball does not pass entirely through and can be used again. Visiting his family in Kentucky after having lived virtually all his life in the North Woods, John Tanner fell ill. He grew claustrophobic when nursed inside of a house and had to sleep outside in his brother's yard to restore his strength. And once he returned to Sault Ste. Marie and told his story, he vanished. He was suspected of a murder, but that charge was later thought false. He never turned up. As Lisa said, he vanished into his own legend. His end was as mysterious and tragic as the outline of his life in this beautiful, unforgiving country. And he was, to all respects, a quote-unquote white Indian and saw the world as an Ojibwe in his first narrative of Native life from an Ojibwe point of view. All right, so I think I'll end on that chapter 1 and 2. Next time we'll do chapter 3 on the rock paintings. So anyway, thanks for joining in. I hope you liked this message. It's more interesting to me than B.F. Skinner. Bye, everybody.